Minecraft has had a total of 18 major releases or updates since 1.0, including minor updates as well as beta and alpha versions, and that number is substantially higher. Just like every game, Minecraft has had its fair share of updates which have changed the game dramatically, for better or for worse. Today we talk about 7 of Minecraft's most hated updates receiving much negative feedback and oh so much controversy. From making the game almost unplayable, to breaking older Minecraft worlds, and to changing core mechanics, there have been many updates which have upset the Minecraft community. We'll be covering versions of the game, from classic through to InfDev and to modern releases, and I guarantee you won't have heard the story of all of these versions before, as they have mostly been forgotten. So without further ado, let's begin. But before we do, of course, did you know originally the subscribe button on YouTube was blue back in 2006, it was updated to yellow in 2007 and changed again in 2010, but you can still find old videos where people say, press the yellow button.
Press the yellow button!
Strange, isn't it? I think red is better though. Anyways, what was the point of this? Oh yeah, make sure to hit that blue, yellow, red button for me. No pressure. The earliest controversial Minecraft update was Classic 0.0.14a. This version added multiple new blocks, new terrain generation, new water mechanics, better mouse block controls, and trees. Upon the version being teased in a video by Notch on his now private Minecraft channel, the small community of players at the time were quite excited. Furthermore, the famous vertex and color offset feature was also meant to be a part of this update, as teased by Notch in another video. While quite gimmicky, you have to understand that the game did not have anything even close to this kind of feature at the time. There were no texture packs, mods, or anything else really. So you can imagine that people were kind of excited to try out the vertex and color offsets feature. But when the much hyped 0.0.14a was finally released, there would be much controversy. The version was incredibly buggy, from missing textures or texture bugs to mouse control issues. For some players, their prior worlds, known as levels at the time, couldn't even be loaded in this newer version, and for the unluckiest players, the game would boot up to a white screen, rendering them unable to even play, although considering the mess this update was, maybe they were the lucky ones all along. Most of the bugs and issues would be swiftly patched by Notch, although one such patch accidentally made the mouse completely unusable. There were also a variety of controversial changes in this update which players took a disliking to. You could no longer press R to randomly respawn around the map. There was now a set spawn you always spawned at. Players generally disliked this because back then they would use R to reposition and travel around the world, as walking around was slow without the ability to sprint. Even more annoying though was the fact that this respawn feature wasn't exactly flawless, often spawning you in water below ocean level, crashing the game and bringing up that beloved white screen. But worst of all, this version didn't even have the ability to toggle on the vertex and color offsets, leaving many players disappointed. Nevertheless, the update was very impactful on the game, but also riddled with controversy. InfDev 201.00227-1 was the first ever InfDev version of Minecraft, and therefore the first version of the game where worlds became infinite. Prior to this, Minecraft worlds were limited in size, so you can imagine that the world size becoming infinitely bigger was a major update and incredibly impactful for the time. However, this update was also ridden with controversy. You see, since worlds became infinite, older worlds from in-dev versions and prior were not supported and could not be loaded in the newer InfDev versions of the game. Imagine that when Mojang released 1.18, they told you that all the worlds created before 1.18 could not be updated and used. How upset would that make the player base? Furthermore, as you can imagine, the update came with lots of bugs and issues which displeased the community at the time. The Minecraft community was split, with some players at the time asking Notch to just keep the worlds as finite, or at least have a separate option to generate finite worlds. Notch did promise at one point that in-dev worlds would eventually be supported, but that never came to be, and as such the community had to create tools such as MC Edit in order to update their game level files to be compatible with InfDev. Massive thanks to Method for recreations of these earlier versions, as well as information surrounding their controversy, as unfortunately during 2009 and 2010, when all this was happening, I was 7 years old, and the only PC game experience I had was Pop Tropica on school computers. Make sure to check out his channel. Before Minecraft 1.9 was released, there was a strong argument that Beta 1.8 was the worst update in Minecraft history. And while the issues with this update weren't as obvious at first as 1.9, they were still major. Let me paint the picture of why Beta 1.8 was so generally disliked back in 2011. Prior to Beta 1.8, many of Minecraft's core mechanics were quite different. There was no hunger bar, no sprinting, you healed right away upon eating food, certain items didn't stack, weapons and armor functioned slightly differently, so you can imagine, with such a major game overhaul, players were frustrated. Healing and the newly introduced food bar were one of the most controversial features, with some players arguing they shouldn't have to eat if they don't take any damage.
Before, if you didn't take any damage, you didn't have to eat. And in my opinion, that should still be a thing.
Before Beta 1.8, if a player was skilled enough to never take any damage, they would never have to use their resources to heal. Also, back in Beta 1.8, hearts healed much slower upon having a full food bar, so it was even more frustrating to players back then, as the time it took to heal went from almost instant to potentially multiple minutes. One of the major issues with the update, however, was the changes to terrain generation. In the developer versions of Beta 1.8, used to showcase to players what the update would be like, the terrain was a mix of Beta 1.7's great terrain generation and the newer Beta 1.8 terrain. So you could still find massive mountains, overhangs, and just interesting looking terrain around the world relatively often. However, when Beta 1.8 would actually be released, the Beta 1.7 elements of the terrain were all but gone, leaving behind a flat, uninteresting, and incredibly repetitive style of terrain generation that, while being more realistic and polished looking at first, would become very boring very quickly. In order to find any resemblance of interesting terrain, you would have to look for extreme hills, which had a contradicting name because these hills were far from extreme or interesting, still falling short compared to Beta 1.7's terrain. There was very little variety, that was the core argument, and it didn't help that oceans, the most boring biome and terrain in the game at the time, became very large to the point that some players would begin to call them endless. Fortunately though, the terrain would get updated in 1.7, making it more interesting again. But surprisingly, 1.7.2 is also an addition to this list of controversial updates. It wasn't a major update, and it was only one of 8 versions of 1.7, so how much could it really have changed? Well, in 1.7.2, cave generation was tweaked, making caves much less dense, sprawling, and interconnected. Basically, caves got less intricate and more boring. Large caves which would spread out underground and connect like crazy, known by players at the time as Swiss cheese caves, were largely removed, and the so-called endless caves players loved exploring were no more. Here's a GIF comparing cave generation from 1.6.4 and a 1.7.2 snapshot, and if you look, you'll notice how less dense and spread out the caves have become. I'll show some side-by-side footage of pre-1.7.2 caves and post-1.7.2 caves now as well. Interestingly, initial reactions upon discovering this change were somewhat positive, with players stating they hated how they would constantly run into caves when strip mining, stating it ruined the game's realism. That being said, players quickly realized that caves had become much more boring. They didn't feel as deep, mysterious, and adventurous, seeming to end all too quickly. Mods were made that restored the quote-unquote Swiss cheese cave generation, and they did gain some popularity, displaying players did want the old generation back. Furthermore, some players refused to update beyond 1.7 due to the changes, stating that they would forever keep their survival world on older versions. But for the most part, the general player base did not even notice the changes, or just chalked it up to a bad seed. In the coming years, we would often see players reminiscing on the game, saying they wish they could go back and play it for the first time, or they wish it felt the same as it did when they were younger. As someone whose very first base was built in a massive sprawling cave system back in beta, I believe that the cave changes made the game feel much less mystifying, scary, as well as wild. Instead, they became much more predictable and boring. Oh boy, 1.9, where do I even begin? Likely the most controversial, hated, and outright despised update of them all. Now, I'm sure you all know why 1.9 was so hated. The PvP changes were far from desired, and many found the changes made PvP boring and more unenjoyable. With all the updates we've talked about today, most of the community got over it eventually, or they were rectified later on. But with 1.9, that was not the case. Servers to this day, over 5 years later, still use 1.8 combat. Many of the most popular Minecraft minigames and game modes are still running natively on 1.8. This update literally split the community in two, with some players never updating or playing on newer versions again. So why was 1.9 overwhelmingly hated though? Well, to put it simply, it couldn't have been released at a worse possible time. Minecraft was already on a steady decline in popularity during 2015, and at the time, minigames and PvP were one of the game's most popular draws, keeping older players interested. So, when many players were losing interest in the game, and had been playing minigames due to disinterest in the game's latest updates, which had been quite underwhelming to be fair, releasing 1.9 and changing one of the game's most core and loved mechanics only left a sour taste in players' mouths. Minecraft 1.8 had released in September of 2014, and 1.9 didn't release until February of 2016, a year and a half later. This meant the game got no new content for a year and a half. So players eagerly awaited over a year and a half just to be hit with changes they didn't expect or ever want. To this day, the community is still divided between 1.8 and 1.9 combat, with some players refusing to play any modern versions of the game, and while combat snapshots were announced over 2 years ago now, they seem to have been put on hold for the time being, and it's likely we won't see any new changes for the near future. And while 1.9 was so hated and controversial, it wouldn't end there. 1.10, released not long after, was also slightly controversial for the simple fact that it was incredibly lackluster. All 1.10 added were 3 new nether blocks, bone blocks, and 3 new mobs. And those 3 mobs are the most useless and boring mobs the game has to offer: strays, husks, and polar bears. Husks were just a desert variant of the zombie, which gave you hunger upon being attacked. Strays were just a snow theme of the skeleton that gave you slowness when being attacked. And polar bears were a mob which did literally nothing new, had no new mechanics, and didn't drop any new items, or any items at all as a matter of fact, and could only be found in snow biomes. So not only were these 3 new mobs quite rare to encounter, but they didn't even do anything that cool or worthwhile of their rarity, and were just alternate variants of already existing mobs. In fact, most players wouldn't be able to tell the difference between 1.9 and 1.10 if they walked through the overworld for a few hours. That's how little it changed the game. Players were more confused than anything on Reddit and other forums, questioning why the update had so little content, mentioning it felt unfinished as well as rushed. Some players even coined it as 1.10, the most underwhelming update ever, a name more fitting than the Frostburn update. Finally today, we're going to be briefly talking about 1.13. 1.13 was generally a well-received update. I mean, it added some awesome new features to oceans, which were in dire need of attention. But what 1.13 did horribly was destroy the game's performance. 1.13 made Minecraft run so much worse, not only on client side, but also on server side as well. Chunks generally loaded slower, server memory usage shot up, and some players could barely even play the vanilla game on their computers anymore. And while it did improve with newer updates such as 1.13.1 and 1.13.2, to this day we still have not yet gotten performance as good as 1.12 again. Servers such as 2B2T could literally not update to 1.13 due to performance issues, and large technical SMPs like Psycraft chose not to due to issues it could have. Many public servers chose to run natively on 1.12 or lower and use plugins to support newer versions due to its abysmal performance. Optifine became a must for some players on lower end systems who could barely get playable frames anymore. Overall, it just completely butchered Minecraft's client and server performance, but fortunately it has been improving steadily over time. And that wraps it up for now. As always, if you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe, go smack that red button for me. Join my Discord and follow me on Twitter, links are down below. Thank you all so much for watching.